On January 27, 2005, world leaders gathered in southern Poland to mark the 60th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. The day was blustery and snowy, but the ceremony at the Nazi death camp was held outdoors. Most of those in attendance, including French President Jacques Chirac and Russian President Vladimir Putin, made the best of the weather, wearing dark, formal overcoats and dress shoes or boots, balancing the need for warmth with the dignity of the event. But there was one in the crowd who didn't fit in. In a sea of black-coated, distinguished world leaders, Vice President Dick Cheney wore a bulging olive gray parka with his name emblazoned across the front and a fluffy fur-trimmed hood. Beneath the hood, he wore a navy knit ski cap embroidered with the words Staff 2001, and on his feet were bulky, lace-up hiking boots. In any other context, the Vice President's clothing would have been ideal. But in a solemn memorial ceremony honoring the tens of thousands killed at Auschwitz, Cheney's apparel was embarrassingly out of place. One journalist had this to say: "There is little doubt that intellectually Cheney approached the Auschwitz ceremony with thoughtfulness and respect. But symbolism is powerful. That's why the piercing cry of a train whistle marked the beginning of the ceremony, and the glare of searchlights signaled its end. The Vice President might have been warm in his parka, ski cap, and hiking boots, but they had the unfortunate effect of suggesting that he was more concerned with his own comfort than the reason for braving the cold at all." In today's parable, we learn that what you're wearing to an important occasion has serious consequences. Jesus is in Jerusalem during Holy Week. His opponents are conspiring against him. These religious leaders of the Jews have had enough. They have rejected him. They're already plotting ways to get rid of this guy. And so, Jesus tells a story aimed right at them. So I'm reading from Matthew 22, verses 1 through 14. Jesus spoke to them again in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like a king who prepared a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his servants to those who had been invited to the banquet to tell them to come, but they refused to come. Then he sent some more servants and said, 'Tell those who have been invited that I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and fattened cattle have been butchered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they paid no attention and went off, one to his field, another to his business. The rest seized his servants, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his army and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. Then he said to his servants, 'The wedding banquet is ready, but those I invited did not deserve to come. Go to the street corners and invite to the banquet anyone you find.' So the servants went out into the streets and gathered all the people they could find, both good and bad, and the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guest, he noticed a man there who was not wearing wedding clothes. 'Friend,' he asked, 'how did you get in here without wedding clothes?' The man was speechless. Then the king told the attendants, 'Tie him hand and foot and throw him outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are invited, but few are chosen.'" The kingdom of God is like a party, says Jesus. And that sounds like good news, especially if you like parties. But what sort of party is this? It's a very serious party, a royal wedding party. This is not the sort of party where you turn up when you like and come as you are. This wedding party began with a sort of save-the-date notice. It is followed by the summons carried by the host's servants when the banquet is ready. All the important people have been invited. The nobles, the clergy, politicians and legal people, community leaders, business people, movers and shakers from across the king's domain. But strangely, none of them want to come. Let's look at the three different types of no to the king's invitation. We see disinterest, just refusing to come. We see distraction, they just go back to work. And we see contempt, seizing the servants, mistreating them, and killing them. Let's take the first two, disinterest and distraction. Probably the most important question Jesus ever asked was, "Who do you say that I am?" Yet getting people to even consider that can be incredibly difficult. Some people might think, "I'm just not that interested." Some people think, "That's just not for me." Maybe it's just a matter of a heart that is closed to the call of God. For the chief priests and Pharisees in the audience, that certainly seems to be the case. They thought they were the people of God, but when the time comes and they're called to the banquet, their hearts are just too hard. Some people might think, "Yep, all this stuff about Jesus and God sounds interesting, and I really ought to investigate it, but not now. I'm busy. My job demands much of my time. There's a lot happening with my family. The grandkids need entertaining. I just signed up for cable TV." We need to understand that this isn't just anyone. It's God calling us. So we need to address whatever might be keeping us busy, because ultimately, whatever it is, it's getting in the way of a relationship with God. It doesn't matter whether it's due to disinterest or distraction. You are, in effect, saying no to God. That's what's happening in the parable, and it's what Jesus is saying of the religious leaders. The third type of no, contempt, is shocking, seizing the servants, mistreating them, and killing them. This is how some people respond to the great news about the kingdom of God. It happened then, Jesus himself being crucified. It happened in the past with the prophets being rejected, and it certainly happens today too. In our culture, the response by most people will be disinterest or distraction. But don't think for a moment that there isn't contempt too. Well, the king is a bit befuddled by the no-shows, so he reissues his invitation a little more forcefully in case anyone misunderstood the exact nature of the party, or perhaps missed the fact that not attending was not really an option. Some invitees even assault and kill the servants. In his anger, the king then sends in his troops to destroy both the perpetrators and their city. With the banquet ready, the king is determined that it will go forward. And so, the servants are sent out again, this time to the very limits of the territory, the street corners in verse 9. They are to bring in everyone, rich and poor, black and white, slave and free, young and old, male and female, wise and ignorant, good and bad. And this time it seems that nobody takes the king's invitation lightly. And so, the story seems to be concluding with a happy scene of a palace filled with guests enjoying a great party. Everybody appears to be having a good time, and the king is there, strolling among his invited guests, greeting each of them regardless of their color or status, until he finds one character who didn't bother to get dressed properly. It seems that this poor fella, who has only just been gathered off the street, maybe didn't have money to purchase a wedding garment, let alone the time, is thrown out. And not just outside, but into the final judgment of the weeping and gnashing of teeth. The end of this story is a little odd. We might expect that the king will order the man to leave the banquet hall, but the way the king puts it is harsh. It's the language of God's judgment on those excluded from the kingdom of God. Jesus often uses such language, so the meaning is very clear. The effect is to shock hearers of the story into a sudden awareness that the story is saying something important. Actually, it's about God's kingdom. And Jesus says, the kingdom of God is just like that. Many are called or invited, but few are chosen. Outsiders are brought in. The good and the bad are gathered together. God's gracious invitation has been issued to all, and some that we would never expect to be in the kingdom are there, while others we expected to see are nowhere to be found. End the story here, Jesus, and you have the perfect parable about the gracious invitation of God for all to come to His feast, His kingdom. But Jesus does not end the parable. There is more, much more. In fact, the main point has yet to be made. Darkness, weeping, and gnashing teeth is not the way you want Jesus to end a parable about God's kingdom. The man without a wedding garment came to a party but ended up in hell. We can't help but pity the underdressed man and question the king's punishment. The king's servants had urged him to come to the banquet, even though he was at the edge of town, even though he was on the fringes of society. They wanted him to come. Should a man like this be expected to dress appropriately? And should the king care so much about what his guests wear as long as they come to the party? Isn't God's banquet, God's kingdom, about grace? Are we not meant to come just as we are? Could it be that God invites us to come as we are, but not stay as we are? Could it be that Jesus is trying to make us take a hard look at how we respond to God's gracious invitation to be a part of His kingdom? When you hear God's invitation to be a part of His glorious kingdom, to come as you are, how do you respond? Do you refuse to be a part of the kingdom, much like those who refused to come to the feast in the first place? Are the things of the world more important and more appealing to you than the things of the kingdom of God? You don't have time now for God? Maybe later? What a mistake that is. What happens? The same thing that happened to those who refused the invitation to the banquet. Destruction. We don't like to talk or hear about God's judgment on sinners. We'd much rather talk about or hear about God's love. God is a God of love, but God is also a God of judgment. We cannot take His love or His gracious invitation too lightly, like those who made up excuses for not attending the banquet. Or we may find that we have gained the whole world, but lost our souls. Or maybe you do take God up on His gracious invitation to come as you are into His kingdom. But the fact that you have done that makes no difference in how you live your life. A lot of people are that way. They take God up on His gracious invitation, but it doesn't really matter to them that they have done so. They may make some surface changes to their lives, but nothing drastic. We're not given a list of specific criteria that moves one from the many invited to the few chosen. But Jesus seems to be saying there is further accountability beyond just saying yes to the invitation to the banquet. Could it be that it means changing your life? Letting Christ make a difference in how you live your life? You can come as you are, but you can't stay as you are. We must show Jesus' love in our lives. We must show that we are a part of the kingdom of God by letting the kingdom of God completely change us. Putting on the robe of love and righteousness by reaching out to those in need, in the simple ways and also in the more difficult ways. If we are going to be transformed as a church, we have to be transformed as individuals. When we have social issues like gun violence or poverty or racism or a pandemic, our government will often make laws to combat these problems. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. But if people's hearts are not changed, if we're not people whose lives have been transformed to serve God and His will, if we don't dress ourselves in righteousness, then our success in improving our community and our world is going to be limited. Pastor and writer Henry Blackaby says, "While leaders and governments can influence a nation, there is no group of people who can determine the future of a nation like God's people." It's not necessarily the big and important people who are worthy to attend God's great celebration of His kingdom. All sorts of people are invited. You don't have to be a good person to get God's invitation. Jesus Himself delivered that invitation by mixing with the most dubious characters and the most looked down on people in the society of His time. You don't have to qualify at all to get God's invitation. That's grace, and we often don't take it seriously enough. But Jesus' parable is clear. We will be judged based upon our righteousness, based upon our wedding garments. In the apocalypse described in Revelation, the faithful witnesses who serve Christ until death prepare for the wedding supper of the Lamb by clothing themselves in righteous works. How can we prepare wedding clothes for the heavenly banquet? Well, this is the way one commentator put it, and I think it's a beautiful way to describe it. He says, "Put on linen robes of holiness. Adorn your head with garlands of worship. Dress your sleeves in flowing folds of peace. Embroider your fabrics with stitching of proclamation and truth. Affix to your hem tassels of healing and brilliant beading of liberation. Wrap yourself in scarves of justice and ornament your arms and neck with golden bangles of wisdom." Now, I want to give you another explanation for the guest who was thrown out of the banquet. Other biblical scholars think that the king would have provided the guest with a wedding garment as they came in the door. In fact, because they were called at the last second, and they would have included people from all walks of life, including the very poor, the king must have provided clothes. So if that's the case, why would this man not have put the clothes on? When the king asked him how he got in, he is speechless. Obviously, it's not because a garment wasn't available, scholars say. Maybe it's because he thought he was good enough as he was to be in the presence of the king, that actually he was worthy. You could say that he wanted God's kingdom, he wanted God's benefits, he wanted God's salvation, but he wanted them on his own terms and in his own way. He wanted the things of God, but he didn't want to have to change in response. He wasn't willing to put off his old self and to put on Christ. He's failed to understand, just like the religious elite, that you're only made worthy because God at His own expense wants to clothe you with salvation. The kingdom of God is not where the people have earned their place at the table. The kingdom of God is where God has paid the price for you to be there. So, what about you? What are you wearing? The wedding banquet of the Son is coming. We will gather at His festive table and join in the celebration of God's reign. Grace has invited us to enter in. The doors are flung wide open, and the servants of the King await our arrival. You can refuse outright, or you can arrive in sloppy clothes with no evidence of righteousness. The King is coming to inspect His guest. He is seeking worthy attendance at His Son's marriage supper. What are you wearing? A couple of questions for you to think about after this parable. First of all, what changes in my life does Jesus want me to make based on this parable? And secondly, who are 3 people you know who need to be invited into a relationship with God. How can you either invite them to meet Jesus, invite them to know you better, or invite them to church this week?